The talk you are about to hear is by Sensei Richard von Sturmer. The teisho today, Tuesday, November the 26th, is on the nature of Mara. And this topic came up quite strongly for me after the election results in the United States. It's sort of in limbo at the moment. 50-something days remain of Biden's presidency, and then the other guy takes over. So we're living in strange times, and more than ever it's good to have this simple practice of Zazen. We face the wall, lower our eyes, and turn inward, not to escape the world, but to stabilize our mind and recharge our batteries. Out there in the media universe, we're slipping into an age of delusion, of false truths. In Buddhism, the three treasures are greed, anger, and delusion. And in the United States, the president-elect embodies all of the three poisons big time. He ticks all the boxes. On some level, knowing what a despicable person he is, the majority of Americans have voted for him for the promise of cheaper petrol, a few dollars less to pay for food at the supermarket, or for protection from an illusory enemy across the border. They've fallen for his lies, hook, line, and sinker. And the president-elect is poised to drag the United States into a dark future, at least for the next 4 years. Before the elections, Steve Reisner wrote in Slate, that's an online magazine, "There is still no language that conveys what the stakes really are. This election is not about politics. It's much more basic. It's about how the American determines what is real." Well, the majority of Americans have voted for a gross distortion of reality. They've voted for Mara. Mara is a demon, the opponent of the Buddha. You may say, oh, it's wrong to demonize the president-elect. Sorry, he is a demon, and he's been openly displaying his vitriolic, vindictive, and duplicitous nature for what seems to be a lifetime. Years ago, a senior member of the Rochester Zen Center and a lawyer in Manhattan was part of a legal team that met him at Trump Tower. And the member of the Zen Center described his face as a mass of snakes. That was the impression that he left. Steve Reisner states that the basic issue going into the elections was about how the American determines what is real. We need to widen this. It's about all of us determining what is real. We're awash with media images, and an increasing number of them are generated by AI. artificial intelligence. At the moment, it's not too difficult to distinguish an AI-produced image or a deep fake video from real ones. But artificial intelligence is an evolving technology, and the line between what is real and what is an illusion will become increasingly blurred as the years go on. Welcome to the world of Mara, the one who loves deception and delusion. In China, Zen, or as it was known in China, Chan, it was known as the clear-eyed sect. And the clarity that comes from our Zazen can help us navigate the increasingly complex world we live in. Zazen enables us to see things as they are, to see things clearly, and not be deceived or manipulated by any AI-generated content or the pictures being painted by a corrupt politician. In the Pali Suttas, the original teachings of the Buddha, whenever Mara tried to lead the Buddha away from the path of liberation, the Buddha would exclaim, "I see you, Mara." And with that, Mara would slink away. Mara has many names: the corrupter, the tempter, the killer, the end maker, the kinsman of the negligent, and the obstructor. And in Greek, diabolos, demon, means the one who throws something across the path, the one who obstructs us in our practice. That's Mara. He rules the sixth heaven, the highest heaven in the world of desire. In Buddhist cosmology, there are three worlds. The world of desire, that's the world that we live in. The world of form, it's the realm of devas, heavenly beings, and the realm of the world of the formless. But we're all stuck in this world of desire. And Mara delights in manipulating others to do his will. He is said to weep when someone becomes a Buddhist nun or a monk, because that person has made a commitment to the Buddha way and is therefore on the path to liberation. So Mara sort of personifies the passions and desires that overwhelm human beings, as well as everything that blocks their progress towards enlightenment and causes them to stray from the path. Bhikkhu Bodhi, a modern-day translator of Pali texts, he writes, "Mara is seen as an evil deity who tries to divert aspirants from the path of liberation. Unlike Satan, he is not particularly concerned with inducing people to commit deeds that will lead them into hell. He remains concerned with keeping them in the snare of sensuality and thereby preventing them from escaping the round of rebirth." So that's Mara's main role as the tempter, is to tempt us away from the path. See, and he deploys many means to do that. Climate change, it's just a hoax. turn a blind eye from what's happening in Gaza. Just, look after yourself. Don't care about others. Don't even think about the greater good. That's Mara in operation. Interestingly, there are few images of Mara in classical Buddhism. I did an image search in Google. And I think this points to his inherent invisibility and his role as a shape changer. But more importantly, it's gives us a clue to his psychological nature. He is the voice that whispers in your ear, "You're no good. You're hopeless. You can never realize your true nature." That's the voice of Mara. Paradoxically, for those of us who are on the path, the very mind that strives for clarity, for seeing into our true nature, seems to throw up countless obstacles in order to impede our progress. And that's just the way it is. That's our Mara nature. All such obstacles are impermanent. All those little voices that try to discourage us are impermanent. We just have to acknowledge them, to see through them, and to pay them no heed. This is an important part of practice. To realize when we get stuck, when we get judgmental, especially about ourselves. When negative thoughts come up about ourselves, you can say, "Ha, I see you, Mara." And in our practice of Zazen, we have to have faith in ourselves, faith in the teachings of the great Zen masters. Lin Chi said, "What ails you? Lack of faith in yourself is what ails you." And Mara delights in that lack of faith. To go with this, there's also, where there's a will, there's a want. And we have to acknowledge this. Where there's a will, there's a want. We make resolutions, then resistance comes up. We resolve to sit each day, and then we get caught up in other things. We don't have time. We're too tired. Often, the more forcefully we make a resolution, the stronger the resistance. So, when this happens, just relax a bit. See things clearly. Identify that small voice that tries to dissuade you from practice. "Ah, I see you, Mara." And then continue on the path. And our Mara nature is not separate from our Buddha nature. It's a distortion, and at times a gross distortion of our intrinsic completeness and purity. The Buddha said at the moment of his great enlightenment, "Wonder of wonders, from the very beginning, all beings are Buddha, endowed with wisdom and virtue, lacking nothing. But because of their inverted views, people fail to realize this. Our inverted views, our unwholesome and harmful ways of thinking, speaking, and acting are not who we truly are. It's Mara kicking up the dust of delusion, temporarily blinding us. Or it's Mara in the form of dark clouds, blocking the sun. Again, when we realize and recognize these obstructions, when we take a step back and see things clearly, the dust will settle and the clouds will part. In the Mahayana Sutras, not much attention is paid to Mara. He gets the odd mention, but in the Pali Suttas, original teachings of Buddhism, he appears as the protagonist in a lot of suttas. And so I'd like to look at 4 times in the Buddha's life when Mara tried to tempt him. The first, when the Buddha-to-be, Prince Siddhartha, after witnessing an old person, a sick person, and a dead person, resolved to leave the palace and devote himself to the holy life. And I'll read a passage from Karen Armstrong's book, Budda. She writes, while Prince Siddhartha was still in the palace, suddenly Mara, the lord of this world, the god of sin, greed, and death, erupted threateningly before him. "Don't become a monk. Don't renounce the world," Mara begged. If Gautama could stay at home for just 1 more week, he would become a great warrior king and rule the whole world. Think of what good he could do. He could end life's sufferings with his benevolent government. This was, however, the easy option and a delusion, because pain can never be conquered by force. It was a suggestion of an enlightened being, and throughout Gautama's life, Mara would try to impede his progress and tempt him to lower his standards. He followed Gautama around like an ever-present shadow. Mara could represent what Jungian psychologists would call his shadow side, all the unconscious elements within the psyche which fight against our liberation. And Stephen Batchelor comments, Mara is Buddha's devilish twin. Buddha needs to let go of Mara in order to become Buddha. As long as Buddha lives, he is constantly relinquishing Mara. For Mara is the self to Buddha's selflessness, the fear to Buddha's fearlessness, the death to Buddha's deathlessness. Couldn't help thinking, anyone remember Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes? Well, Mara's a little bit like Moriarty, Sherlock Holmes' arch enemy, always in the shadows, waiting to trip Sherlock Holmes up. Next we'll look at the Buddha before his enlightenment, during his period of great austerities, and we'll read from Living with the Devil, a meditation on good and evil by Stephen Batchelor. In Batchelor's account, the Buddha recalls, I was living on the bank of the Narayanjara River, engaged in deep struggle, practicing meditation with all my strength in the effort to find final freedom. Then Mara came up to me and started talking in words appearing to be full of sympathy. "You are so thin and pale," he said. "You must be nearly dead. It would be far better to live. You could do much good by leading a holy life." So in the first instance, we have Mara trying to dissuade Prince Siddhartha from entering the holy life, and he fails. So now, with the Buddha committing to holy life, Mara wants him to take it easy. You're a monk. You've got a place to sleep at night. You've got enough food to eat. Why struggle? Why engage in such a struggle? Batchelor writes, Mara seems to have the Buddha's best interests at heart. He does not encourage Gautama to do anything evil. His aim is to weaken his resolve to achieve complete enlightenment. So Mara is always aiming to weaken our resolve. I can think of, during a 7-day sesshin, towards the end of the sesshin, the second to last night, or the last night, Mara could be that little voice saying that at the end of the formal sitting, "You've done enough tonight. Time to take a rest, get some sleep. Don't try and do any more late night sitting." In our story, the Buddha recognizes Mara. He says, "I see your troops all around me, Mara, but I will proceed with the struggle. Even if the whole world cannot defeat your army, I will destroy it with the power of wisdom, just as an unfired pot is smashed by a stone." An unfired pot, clay pot, is very brittle. Batchelor writes, identifying with a desire or fear tightens the knot that binds us to it, and thereby the sway it can have over us. Only when Buddha was able to experience the desires and fears that threatened to overwhelm him as nothing but impersonal and ephemeral conditions of the mind and body, did they loosen their power to mesmerize him. This refers to Mara's army and the fear that might strike him, or Mara's daughters, his seductive daughters. Instead of perceiving them as forces of an avenging army intent on his destruction, he recognizes that they were no more solid than brittle, unfired pots that crumble on being struck by a well-aimed stone. As soon as Buddha stops identifying with thoughts, feelings, and sensations that arose within him as me or mine, Mara could no longer influence him. And so it is with us. Not to identify with these negative feelings and emotions that do come up. Next Tuesday, we'll be having our Buddha's Enlightenment ceremony. And so this will be familiar to anyone who's attended previous ceremonies when we tell of the Buddha's great enlightenment. And Mara plays a central role in this. When the Buddha is sitting beneath the Bo tree, just before his great enlightenment, he is assailed by Mara, who throws every sort of temptation conceivable at the Buddha. First, his army of hideous demons attacks the Buddha, embodying all of humanity's deep-seated fears and terrors. The Buddha remains unmoved, and the army's spears and arrows change into flowers and fall to the ground before him. Next, Mara's three beautiful daughters, Tanha, craving, Arati, discontent, and Raga, lust, materialize and try to seduce the Buddha. But as he has transcended all desires, all self-centered impulses, they are unsuccessful and fade away. Finally, when all else has failed, Mara's last temptation is doubt. Speaking with the Buddha's own inner voice, Mara whispers, "Are you really the world-honored one? Are you sure you can attain complete enlightenment? Are you truly worthy?" The Buddha simply touches the earth with his fingers of his right hand, and the earth cries out in response, "He is worthy." At that point, the forces of delusion are defeated, and Mara withdraws. Stephen Batchelor comments, only when Buddha was able to experience the desires and fears that threatened to overwhelm him as nothing but impersonal and ephemeral conditions of body and mind, did they lose their power to mesmerize him. Mara's third and last assault is the most subtle. Again and again, this is self-doubt. This self-doubt arises in practice. We can judge ourselves, and we can see ourselves in a negative light. So, as we've mentioned before, just be aware when these negative views of oneself come up. I remember when our teacher's sister, who's now Sunya Roshi, when she first became a teacher, I think it was on her first 7-day session, she was in the Doksan room. First person comes into Doksan and says, everyone else is doing so well in sesshin, and I'm just a mess. Okay, she gives that person a few encouraging words. Next person comes in, I'm all over the place. I'm no good at this. Everybody's just flying ahead, but I'm just so lagging behind. So she gives that person a few encouraging words. Then the third person comes in and says, I'm no good. I can't do this practice. Everyone else is just so concentrated. And she told us that she at that point she had to restrain herself from laughing. But one after another, people came in with these self-judgments, thinking in delusion that everyone else in sesshin was doing so much better than they were. These things are just temporary delusions that we all have from time to time. Perhaps our fatal flaw is our belief that we're fatally flawed. And of course, there's great significance in the Buddha touching the earth and the earth speaking with its own voice. He is worthy. This is the basic sanity of the earth, which was one of the teachings of Trungpa Rinpoche. Basic sanity of the earth. And we embody that in our zazen, sitting on the mat, unmoving. We become earthed. We return to this basic sanity. Okay. Finally, we have the last time Mara appeared. And this was not long before the Buddha dies. And this is from the great disciples of the Buddha by Nyanaponika Thera and Hellmuth Hecker. They tell it like this. At Visali, the Buddha fell ill with a deadly disease. While together in a beautiful natural setting, the Buddha tells Ananda that if he wished, he could prolong his life for an indefinite time. But Ananda, although given such a clear hint, was distracted by their surroundings and did not beg the Buddha to stay alive out of compassion for all living beings. Not only once, but a second and a third time, the Buddha addressed Ananda in the same way. But each time, Ananda failed to catch the hint. In his confusion, his mind had been ensnared by Mara. Could it be that at just that moment, Ananda was so absorbed in the pleasure of being in companionship with the Buddha that the Master's hint failed to register in his mind? Was it perhaps just this very attachment to the Buddha's company, reinforced by the enchanted evening hour and the peaceful forest, that prevented him from expressing his deepest wishes for a longer life for the Buddha? If Mara had not intervened, Ananda would have asked the Buddha to accept the burden of a prolonged life, and the Buddha would have consented out of compassion for the world. But Mara, afraid that innumerable beings would have thereby escaped from his clutch, hastened to prevent this, and the course of history was sealed. This scene, so poignant and suggestive, belongs to the mystery of the Pali Canon, and one could puzzle about it endlessly. However, even here, Mara does not get the upper hand, for this is the Buddha's last teaching, that everything is impermanent, that even a fully enlightened one must die. In his final discourse to his monks, he reminds them of this and how they must continue to practice. Monks, be islands unto yourselves. Be a refuge unto yourselves, with no other refuge. Let the Dharma be your island. Let the Dharma be your refuge, with no other. He reminds his disciples to abide in mindfulness, in clear awareness, not swayed in the least by any fears or desires. If you do so, then Mara will find no lodgment, no foothold. And throughout the Pali Suttas, Mara not only appears to the Buddha, but also to his disciples. So we'll just look briefly at two other appearances by Mara. In the Sutta the rebuke of Mara, Mara enters Mahamoggallana's belly. Now, Mahamoggallana was the foremost disciple of the Buddha who had psychic powers. He had great psychic powers. So, Moggallana recognizes Mara and says, "Come out, evil one. Do not harass the Buddha. Do not harass his disciple, or it will lead you to your own harm and suffering for a long time." When he is discovered, Mara exits from Moggallana's mouth. Moggallana goes on to tell how he could identify Mara because in a past life he himself was Mara and spent time in hell as a direct result of tormenting a disciple of the Buddha. There's a nice sort of cyclic thing going on in this story. So Moggallana could identify Mara because many lifetimes ago he himself was Mara. And according to the Pali Suttas, the great bodhisattvas and even the Buddha himself have all been Mara in past lifetimes. They know him well because they have been him at one point in their long development towards full enlightenment. And the last example from another sutta goes like this. Thus I have heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling in Savatthi, in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park, where Mara, the evil one, approached the Blessed One and addressed him in verse. There is a snare moving in the sky, something mental which moves about, by means of which I'll catch you yet. You won't escape me, ascetic. And the Blessed One replies in verse, forms, sounds, tastes, odors, and delightful tactile objects. Desires for these has vanished in me. You're defeated, evil maker. Then Mara, the evil one, exclaimed, the Blessed One knows me. And sad and disappointed, he disappeared right there. The Blessed One knows me. It's the echo of, I know you, Mara. This forms, sounds, tastes, odors, delightful tactile objects, desires for these has vanished in me. Of course, these words remind us of the Heart Sutra. No eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. The Buddha dwells in emptiness. And this emptiness renders all of Mara's traps useless. They dissolve into vast emptiness. They're revealed to be just what they really are, impermanent, illusory. Stephen Batchelor comments, Buddha escapes Mara by abiding in emptiness, that open spaciousness of mind where fantasies of being a fearful and isolated self no longer ensnare him. And as long as we too can, to some degree, see through this illusion of a separate, isolated self, then we can see through this true self that is no self. If we can see this true self that is no self, then we won't be tempted by those little voices that whisper to us. To be truly free of Mara's grip, we have to experience the emptiness of the self, its impermanent nature. But just in our everyday life, recognize when the forces of Mara arise. Pay them no heed. Take a step back. Take a deep breath. See things clearly. And continue on the way. We'll stop here and recite the 4 vows.